They dressed her in white like a sacrifice. Her stepsister's cast-off gown, her stepsister's cast-off man, and nobody in that cold marble mansion thought she would survive the week. Nobody told him she would become the reason he'd want to. The iron was too hot. Amara knew it the moment the sole plate kissed the silk, that sharp, small hiss of fabric surrendering to heat, but her hand didn't move fast enough, and by the time she lifted it, a faint brown shadow had already bloomed at the collar's edge. Barely a thumbnail's worth of damage. The kind of mark a generous person would call invisible. Vivian Ose-Mensah was not a generous person. You did that on purpose. Amara set the iron down on the board with a slow, careful click. She didn't turn around. 6 years in this house had taught her the geometry of survival. Too fast read as defiance, and defiance in this household had a price she'd already paid too many times to count. She kept her back straight, her hands flat on the ironing board, her breathing even. It was an accident, she said. She heard Vivian's heels on the marble floor. That deliberate, rhythmic click. The sound of someone who had learned early that the world pays attention to noise. Then the blouse was snatched from the board with a sharp snap of expensive fabric. Accident. Vivian said it like she was spitting out something bitter. You've been having accidents your whole life, haven't you? Your mother accidentally married my father. You accidentally ended up in my house. And now you've accidentally ruined the only blouse I was going to wear to meet J1's lawyers tomorrow. Amara turned. She couldn't help it. Vivian was beautiful in the way that certain expensive, fragile things are beautiful. Designed entirely for display, devastating under the wrong conditions. She stood holding the blouse up to the window light, her long press and curl falling perfectly over one shoulder, her face arranged in an expression of refined disgust. The scorch mark was barely visible even in direct light. They both knew it. I can fix it, Amara said, keeping her voice low and even. There's a solution in the laundry room, if I treat it now. You cannot fix anything. Vivian dropped the blouse on the floor between them. Not by accident. Deliberately. Like punctuation. Like a period at the end of a sentence she had been composing for years. That's the whole point of you, Amara. You ruin things. Everything you touch. She left the room without looking back. Amara stood in the silence that followed. The late afternoon Lagos sun came through the window at a low, molten angle, catching the dust motes floating in the space Vivian had just vacated. The house was quiet in that particular way it got when Aunt Doris was napping. A suspended, dangerous quiet that Amara had learned not to trust, the way you learn not to trust a lull in a storm. She bent down and picked up the blouse herself. Folded it with careful hands. Set it on the dresser. Then she sat on the small wooden stool in the corner, the only seat in Vivian's room that was not for guests, and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. 23 years old. Secondary school was completed by sheer, grinding stubbornness. 1 semester of university accounting, before Aunt Doris quietly stopped paying the fees, smiled sadly, and said the money had run out. A phone with a cracked screen she'd been mending with a strip of clear tape for 4 months. A journal she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her small room near the generator, where the heat came up through the boards at night, and the noise made it hard to sleep. A mother has been in the ground for 3 years. This was the full inventory of Amara Boateng's life. She wasn't bitter, exactly. Bitterness requires some residue of surprise, and Amara had stopped being surprised by anything this household did somewhere around age 17. What she carried instead was something quieter and more stubborn, a low animal refusal to stop. Not hope, precisely. Something beneath hope. Something that lived in the body before the mind gets involved. You will not be this forever, she told herself every morning. The way other people recite scripture. She just hadn't figured out how yet. What she didn't know, couldn't know, sitting on that wooden stool in the thick Lagos heat, was that the how was already in motion. That somewhere in this house, behind the closed door of her stepfather Chief Osa Mensah's study, a phone call was happening that would append every careful, quiet plan she'd never quite gotten around to making. 12,000 kilometers northeast, in a high-rise apartment in Seoul that occupied the entire 43rd floor of a building he owned, Kong Jae-won was losing an argument with silence. Not with his physical therapist, Choi, who stood 3 feet away with a clipboard and the carefully neutral expression of a man who had learned that opinions cost you clients. Not with the parallel bars gleaming under the physiotherapy room's clinical light. With himself. With the particular version of himself that had been living behind his eyes for the past 14 months. Ever since the rain-slicked road in Busan and the sound of impact, and then the long, white nothing of the hospital ceiling. Again, Choi said. Jae-won's hands tightened on the bars. He was 31 years old. He had a jaw that could cut glass and eyes the color of deep water on a cloudy day. Dark, still, and with a quality to them that made people across boardroom tables feel, inexplicably, that he could see through the backs of their skulls. Before the accident, photographers had fought over him. Business journalists had called him the most dangerous mind in South Korean private enterprise. 3 governments had considered him a person of interest without ever quite having the courage to say it out loud. Now he was standing at a set of parallel bars at 7 in the morning, summoning everything he had just to stay upright for 30 seconds. He pushed off from the bars and made it 4 steps before his left leg buckled. Choi moved forward. "Don't," Jae-won said quietly. The single word landed in the room with the particular weight of someone who is accustomed to being obeyed, even in the middle of falling. He caught himself on the bar. Straightened. His jaw was tight, but his face gave nothing else away. He was very good at giving nothing away. He'd been practicing since he was 9 years old, sitting across a dinner table from a father who interpreted any visible emotion as an opening for attack. You learned in that household that the face was a liability. You learned to store everything behind your eyes and show the world only the surface, the flat, unreadable water. Under the water you could have anything. Rage, grief, longing, the specific, crushing loneliness of a man who had built an empire specifically so he would never need anyone. But no one would ever see it. He did the 4 steps again. Made it to 5 this time. "Your father called," Choi said carefully, while making a note. Jae-won said nothing. And there was a message from Mr. Park about the Lagos arrangement. "I'm aware of the Lagos arrangement." The Lagos arrangement. The phrase sat in his mouth like something cold. Vivian Osa Mensah, beautiful, strategic, chosen through a careful alignment of his family's distribution interests and her father's business desperation, had visited him in the hospital exactly twice. The second visit lasted 38 minutes. She spent 12 of them on a call with someone she'd stepped into the hallway to speak to, and when she came back, her smile had been recalibrated in some way he couldn't name but immediately recognized. A week later, through her lawyer, she'd requested a postponement of the engagement proceedings. Postponement. A polite word for abandonment. A corporate word for cowardice. Jae-won had said nothing, in that precise, devastating way he had of saying nothing that communicated everything. He'd signed the papers his own lawyer had drawn up. Closed the file. Returned to his parallel bars and his window and his city full of lights that had nothing to say to him. He hadn't, in 14 months, allowed himself to feel a single thing about it. He told himself that was strength. He was wrong. But he wouldn't know that yet for a while longer. What neither of them could have known. Amara on her wooden stool in the Lagos heat. Jae-won at his window watching Seoul arrange itself below him in the early dark, was that their lives had already been decided. Not by them. Not yet. By a desperate chief's closed-door conversation. By a family's fear of what a powerful, furious Korean man might do if a business arrangement was simply discarded. By the particular cruelty of a beautiful girl who had spent her whole life treating other people as expendable and had finally met a situation that required a body, and looked around and found one she'd never much valued anyway. In 48 hours, Amara Boateng would board a plane for the first time in her life. She would be carrying someone else's name, wearing someone else's obligation, and walking into a world that had been built by and for a man who did not want her there. And the universe, which had been patient and was no longer, would finally begin to collect on everything it was owed. Here's something to think about before we go further. Amara has spent years being told she is not enough, not worth choosing, not worth keeping. Have you ever felt invisible in a place that was supposed to be home? Drop your country, subscribe and comment below. You might be surprised how many people feel exactly the same way. Amara heard them before she saw them. She was coming down the back hallway from the laundry room, the treated blouse folded over her arm, when she caught the sound of Chief Osamensa's voice through the heavy study door, low and tight in a way she'd only heard a handful of times in 6 years. The voice he used when something was slipping out of his control and he hadn't yet decided how afraid to be. She slowed her steps without meaning to. Cannot simply walk away from this, Vivian. Do you understand what I'm telling you? This is not a boyfriend. This is not some Lego socialite you can discard and replace by next weekend. This is Kong Jae-won. A pause. Then Vivian's voice, light, almost bored, the way she got when she'd already made a decision and was only waiting for the world to catch up. He's in a wheelchair, Daddy. He owns 7 companies and has the ear of 3 criminal organizations that I am personally indebted to. The wheelchair is irrelevant. It's not irrelevant to me. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that has weight. Amara stood very still in the hallway. The folded blouse in her arms suddenly felt absurd. She should have moved, walked past, gone upstairs, pretended the thick walls had swallowed every word. But her feet had made their own decision, and so she stood, and she listened, and what she heard next rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of her life. Then we send someone else, Chief Osamensa said. Vivian laughed. A short, sharp sound. Someone else? Who exactly? Amara. Silence. Absolute, total silence, the kind that has texture, that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Amara's hand tightened on the folded blouse without her realizing it. She's not, Vivian started. She carries your mother's married name. She is of age. She is, a pause, a careful choosing of words, available. And Jae-won has never met either of you in person. The correspondence has all been through lawyers and his father's representatives. You can't be serious. I am completely serious. His voice had changed now. The fear had solidified into something harder, the way water becomes ice when the temperature drops past a certain point. I have $2 million of the Kong family investment in this company, Vivian. I have agreements in place that require the legitimacy of a family connection to hold. If you walk away from this engagement with no replacement, no explanation, no. I'm not marrying a paralyzed man. No, a beat. She is. They called her in 20 minutes later. Amara had not moved from the hallway. Not because she was frozen. She was precise and deliberate about that distinction. In the second she had to compose herself before the study door opened and Aunt Doris appeared and said, with remarkable normalness, "Amara, come." She walked in. Chief Osamensa was at his desk. A broad mahogany thing covered in the architecture of a man who needed to feel powerful. Stacked files, a heavy pen set, and a framed photograph of Vivian at her university graduation. He did not look up immediately when she entered, which was a tactic she recognized. Making someone wait for your eyes was its own kind of violence. Vivian was in the chair by the window, arms folded, examining her nails with the studied detachment of someone watching a situation they have already emotionally exited. Aunt Doris closed the door behind them. Amara stood in the center of the room and waited. When Chief Osa finally looked up, his expression was the one she found most difficult to read. Not cruel, not cold. Almost gentle. The look of someone doing something they've decided is reasonable. Sit down, Amara. She sat. I'm going to explain something to you, he said, folding his hands on the desk. And I want you to listen before you speak. Can you do that? She nodded once. He spoke for 4 minutes. She counted them by the clock on the wall behind his head. He used words like opportunity, security, and the family's stability. He explained the Kong connection with the careful tone of a man summarizing a business case. He mentioned, briefly, that there would be a financial arrangement, that she would be provided for, that the marriage would not be without its compensations. He did not once use the word choice. When he finished, the room was quiet. Amara sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the desk between them. She could feel Vivian's eyes on the side of her face. Not guilty, not apologetic. Watchful. The way someone watches a card being placed on a table. And if I say no? Amara asked. Her voice was very calm. She was proud of that later, that her voice was calm. Chief Osa looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his pen. Set it down again. You have lived in this house for 6 years, he said. Schooling, feeding, housing. Your mother's funeral arrangements were handled from this household. A pause. I don't think you want to explore what no looks like, Amara. I genuinely don't. It was not a threat, exactly. Threats are loud. This was quieter than a threat. This was a door being pointed at, and the pointed finger was saying, beyond this door is nothing. And nothing is what you came from. Amara looked at Vivian. Vivian looked back at her with an expression that was almost something human. For one single second, behind the French-tipped nails and the perfected blankness, something flickered. Something that in another life, in another family, might have been shame. Then it was gone. You leave in 3 days, Aunt Doris said from behind her, as if the decision had already been made for some time. Which, Amara understood it had. In Seoul, Jae-won received the news at 11:47 p.m. via message from his chief legal officer. 4 sentences. Precise. Corporate. Bloodless. The original fiancé was unavailable to proceed. A family member would honor the arrangement in her place. Documentation to follow. His response was required within 24 hours. He read it twice. Then he set his phone face down on the desk and sat in the dark for a very long time. And the expression on his face was not the cold fury his staff feared or the visible grief that would have been more forgivable. It was something quieter and more terrible than both. It was the look of a man who has just had confirmed, for perhaps the last time he will allow it to need confirming, that people will always find a way to treat you as a transaction. He picked up his phone. Typed 2 words to his lawyer. Proceed. Fine. Put the phone down. Went back to his window. His city of lights. His 43rd floor of absolute solitude. And somewhere in a house in Lagos, in a small back room near the generator, a 23-year-old woman sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened her journal to a blank page and held her pen above it for a long time without writing anything at all. Because there were things happening inside her chest that she did not yet have the words for. things that felt too large and too sharp and too complicated to be flattened into sentences. Fear was in there, obviously. But underneath the fear, stubbornness, irrationality, and almost offensiveness given the circumstances, was something else. Something that felt dangerously like, fine. Then let this be the door. 3 days later, Amara Boateng boarded a plane for the first time in her life. She had one bag. A dark green carry-on that had been Vivian's and still had a small leather luggage tag with Vivian's initials on it that Amara had not been given time to remove. She wore a plain black dress and her mother's small gold earrings, the only thing she owned that had not come from this family's charity. She sat in the window seat and watched Lagos fall away below her. The sprawl of it, the color, and the impossible noise of it even visible from above in the shape of traffic and structure, and she did not cry. She pressed her fingers against the cold plastic of the armrest, and she breathed. "You will not be this forever," she told herself. For the first time, the words felt less like a prayer and more like a promise she was about to be asked to keep. Soul arrived like a held breath. Amara pressed her face close to the plane window as they descended, the city spreading out below in the early morning dark as a circuit board lit from within, ordered and vast and humming with a kind of precision that Lagos, for all its magnificent chaos, never had. Everything from up here looked intentional, deliberate, like a city that had decided exactly what it was going to be and had simply gone ahead and become it. She felt, for the first time in 3 days, something close to wonder. Then the wheels hit the tarmac, and the feeling folded itself away, because there was a man in a black suit already waiting at arrivals holding a sign that read K. Amara in clean, impersonal print, not her full name, not even a greeting, just a designation, a label, the kind of sign you hold up for cargo, and the wonder was replaced immediately by the cold, clarifying weight of where she actually was and why. The driver did not speak to her in the car. Not from rudeness, she understood. He simply had no English or chose not to use it, and she had exactly 4 words of Korean. Hello, thank you, sorry, and please. She had looked them up on her cracked screen phone somewhere over the Arabian Sea and practiced them quietly until the man in the middle seat glanced at her sideways and she stopped. She watched Seoul through the car window instead. It was early, barely 6, and the city had that particular quality of mornings everywhere. Honest, unguarded, not yet performing. Street vendors are setting up stalls. A woman in a pale coat is walking a very small dog with enormous dignity. A group of school-aged children in uniforms moving in a compact, chattering cluster. Normal life. Human life. She held on to that. The mansion was not what she'd expected. She had prepared herself on the plane for something loud with wealth, the Lagos version of money, which announced itself through size and gold and deliberate excess. What she found instead was a building that was quietly, absolutely sure of itself. Set behind high iron gates on a tree-lined private road, it was modern and severe, all clean angles and floor-to-ceiling glass and dark stone, the kind of architecture that doesn't need to show off because it has nothing left to prove. The gardens were immaculate. The silence was total. A housekeeper, a small, composed woman in her 50s named Mrs. Yoon, whose English was careful and precise, met her at the door and took her bag without ceremony and showed her through an entrance hall that was larger than the entire upper floor of the Ose house. White marble, high ceilings, a curved staircase on the left. Natural light falls through a glass ceiling panel onto a single arrangement of white flowers on a round table in the center of the hall. Beautiful, Amara thought. And completely, utterly without warmth. "Mr. Kong will see you now," Mrs. Yoon said. "Not would you like to rest first, or can I get you anything?" Simply, "He will see you now." As if she were an appointment. Amara straightened her dress. Followed. He was at the far end of the main reception room, positioned beside the window with his back partially to the door. A choice, she understood instinctively, not an accident. A man in a wheelchair who ensures he is never seen from behind, who always controls the angle at which the world approaches him. He turned when she entered, and the full impact of him hit her in a way she hadn't braced for. He was, and she thought this with the precise, almost clinical honesty of someone trying to stay clear-headed, extraordinarily good-looking. Not in a soft way. In the way of something forged rather than formed. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, and the kind of stillness in his face that made the air around him feel dense. He was wearing a dark gray shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and his hands rested on the wheels of his chair with a deliberate looseness that she recognized immediately as control dressed up as ease. He looked at her the way you look at a problem someone else created and left on your desk. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds before he spoke. "You're younger than I expected," he said. His English was immaculate, the faint geometry of an accent underneath it, but clean and precise as everything else in this house. And smaller. Amara held his gaze. "You're quieter than I expected," she said. "Given your reputation." Something shifted in his face, so fast she almost missed it. Not quite surprised. Something adjacent to it. A hairline crack in the marble. "Sit down," he said. "Thank you," she said and sat. He studied her for another moment with those still, dark eyes. Then he said, in a tone that was absolutely conversational, absolutely controlled, and absolutely designed to wound, "I want to be clear with you from the beginning so that we don't waste each other's time pretending. This arrangement exists because my family requires a legal continuity to protect certain business interests. It is contractual. It is temporary, pending a renegotiation that my lawyers are already working on. You will have a room, meals, and a monthly allowance. In return, I require that you appear where required, say what is necessary, and otherwise," he paused, just a breath, "stay out of my way." He said it without cruelty in his voice. That was almost the worst part, the complete absence of any heat in it. As if she were a piece of furniture being informed of its placement. Amara looked at him steadily. The room was cool and bright around them, light bouncing off the pale stone floors, with a faint smell of cedar and something she couldn't name. She could feel the jet lag pressing at the backs of her eyes. She had not slept properly in 3 days. She had been handled and shipped and labeled and delivered like something that did not require consultation. And she was sitting across from a man who had just described her, elegantly but unmistakably, as an inconvenience. She folded her hands in her lap. "Is that everything?" she asked. A pause. Slight. "Yes." "All right," she said. "My turn." His eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "I didn't choose this any more than you did," she said, her voice quiet and level. Not angry. Not pleading. Just straight. "I'm not here to pretend we're something we're not, and I'm not here to get in your way. But I want you to understand something, because I think it's better that we're also clear." She met his gaze directly, fully, without performance. "I have spent 6 years being treated like furniture in someone else's house. I am not going to do it again. Not even here. Not even for..." A small pause, deliberate whatever this is. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. J1 looked at her. Really looked, not the assessing, categorizing look of before, but something more careful and less managed. Like a man who asked a question expecting an echo and heard something else entirely come back. He said nothing. She stood. "I'll find my room. Mrs. Yoon will. I'll find it," she said simply. and she walked to the door with her back straight and her mother's gold earrings catching the morning light, and she did not look back. J1 sat in the silence she left behind. His hands were still on the wheels, very still. The window in front of him showed the garden, the precise, controlled garden, everything in its exact place, nothing growing that hadn't been told to. He had prepared for tears, for nerves, for desperate sweetness, or alternatively for cold calculation wearing a warm mask. He had dealt with all of those before and had systems in place for each of them. He had not prepared for that. He did not examine the feeling that sat in his chest in the aftermath. He was very practiced at not examining feelings. He simply noted, with the detached precision of a man logging unexpected variables, that the morning had not gone the way he'd planned. Then he turned back to his window. But for the rest of the day, through 2 conference calls, a legal briefing, and 3 hours of work he barely registered. He kept returning, without meaning to the exact tone of her voice when she'd said, "Not even here. Not even for whatever this is." The tone of someone who had already lost everything that could be taken and had therefore, in some deeply inconvenient way, become impossible to threaten. He didn't know what to do with that. It bothered him more than he would ever admit. The marriage was formalized on a Tuesday. There was no ceremony, no flowers, no music, no gathered faces soft with feeling. A lawyer arrived at 9 in the morning with a briefcase and 2 copies of a document, and a pen that he set on the dining table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped attaching meaning to the paperwork of other people's lives. J1 signed first, his signature fast and clean and completely without hesitation. The signature of a man closing a business deal he finds mildly irritating. He didn't look at her while he signed. Amara picked up the pen. She held it above the paper for exactly 3 seconds, not from doubt, not from drama, but because she was making herself feel the weight of it. She had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of her first night in this house, that she would not sleepwalk through her own life anymore. Not even the parts of it she hadn't chosen, especially those parts. She signed. The lawyer gathered his papers, nodded at each of them with identical professional neutrality, left. And that was that. J1 wheeled himself from the table without a word. Amara sat for a moment in the chair, looking at the faint indentation her pen had made on the table's surface through the paper. Outside the tall dining room windows, the garden was doing something beautiful. A light wind moving through the trees in long, slow waves. The morning sun breaking apart on the leaves into 100 shifting pieces of gold. She watched it until she felt steady. Then she stood up and went to find something useful to do. The house had a logic to it that she began to map in those first few days, the way you learn the geography of any new and unfamiliar territory, carefully, with attention, committing landmarks to memory. The kitchen was at the back, vast and stainless and impeccably organized, managed primarily by a cook named Mr. Han, who arrived at 7 and left at 3 and communicated with Amara primarily through gestures and an expression of mild, benign curiosity. The library was on the 2nd floor, floor-to-ceiling shelves, a reading chair by the window, books in Korean and English and what she thought might be Japanese, the spines worn in a way that told her they had actually been read. There was a gym on the ground floor, adjacent to the physiotherapy room where Choi came 3 mornings a week. There were 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining room and a terrace that wrapped around the south side of the building and looked out over the garden and, beyond the garden wall, the distant glittering suggestion of the city. She discovered on her 3rd day that J1 used the library at night. She had come up at 1:30 because she couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was a different quality of silence than she was used to. Not the held-breath silence of a household managing a volatile mood, but something emptier and stranger, and she had thought a book might help. She pushed the library door open quietly and found the lamp already on and him already there. At the desk in the corner, surrounded by papers and the blue-white glow of a laptop screen. He looked up. She looked at him. "I didn't know you used it at night," she said. "I didn't know you used it at all," he said. A beat. She nodded toward the shelves. "I'll just—" "It's a library," he said, in a tone that was not quite permission and not quite welcome but occupied the narrow hallway between them. "Take what you need." She moved to the shelves. Ran her fingers along the spines, slowly, the way you do when you're genuinely looking rather than performing the act of looking. The books smelled of old paper and something slightly sweet she couldn't identify. She pulled out a collection of short stories. The cover was in Korean, but the spine said translated edition in small English letters, and settled into the reading chair by the window without further comment. For the next hour, they occupied the same room in total silence. And the silence was not comfortable. Not exactly. But it had a texture to it that was different from hostility. It was the silence of two people who are both, for once, simply being what they are without performing anything for the benefit of the other. Amara didn't fully register that this was extraordinary until later, when she was back in her room. That for 1 hour in the middle of the night, in a house in a country 12,000 kilometers from everything she had ever known, she had felt almost like herself. The logistics of appearing married fell into a rhythm that was awkward at first and then simply strange. Mrs. Yoon had explained, quietly and without editorializing, that certain members of the household staff were connected, as all things in Jae-won's world seemed to be, to people who reported to people. Appearances mattered. Consistency mattered. The story was that the original engagement had proceeded as planned, that the woman now in residence was his wife, and that everything was as it should be. Any visible fracture in that story had consequences that Mrs. Yoon did not specify, but her expression communicated with perfect clarity. So there were dinners. Every evening at 7, in the formal dining room, the two of them sat at opposite ends of a table that was long enough to make the arrangement almost comedic. 12 feet of polished wood between them, the silverware perfectly placed, Mr. Hon's cooking immaculate and wasted on the silence. The first dinner, they didn't speak at all. The second, Jae-won said, without looking up from his food, "You're not eating the fish." "I'm eating the fish," she said. "You moved it to the side of the plate." "I moved it to the side of the plate and then I'll eat it." A pause. "Why?" "Because I eat things in a specific order." She said it plainly, without apology. "Vegetables first, then protein, then whatever I'm most looking forward to." He looked up then, with the expression of someone who has just encountered a data point they weren't expecting. "The fish is what you're most looking forward to." "Yes." He looked back down at his plate. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, infinitesimally, almost imperceptibly, as if a single molecule of tension had quietly left the room. By the fifth dinner he had stopped eating the mushrooms on his plate. She noticed he always moved them to the side, and without thinking she said, "You don't like mushrooms?" He glanced up. "They have the texture of regret." She stared at him. He said nothing further, with the perfect composure of a man who absolutely did not just say that. But Amara felt, for the first time in weeks, the dangerous pull of a smile, and she pressed her lips together and looked very carefully at her plate and did not let it out. The small things accumulated the way small things do, without announcement, without drama, just the quiet layering of detail upon detail until a picture begins to emerge. She noticed that he took his coffee without anything, no sugar, no milk, but always let it sit for exactly 4 minutes before drinking it, timing it absently against his watch. She noticed that he moved through the house in a particular pattern, library, then his office, then the terrace when the weather allowed, and that he was always back inside before sunset, which she filed away as something she did not yet understand. She noticed that he read physical newspapers, 4 of them, in 2 languages. and that he folded them precisely when he was finished, and that despite the crease of concentration on his face when he read them, he never seemed to find whatever he was looking for in them. She noticed that he watched her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. Not in a way that made her feel studied. In a way that made her feel, and this was the word she kept returning to with uncomfortable frequency, noticed. In the specific way that is different from being watched. Being watched is surveillance. Being noticed is something else. Something more interior. Something that suggests the person looking is not collecting information, but simply looking. Finding. She did not examine this too carefully. She was careful in those early days to be very sensible about everything. She was not always successful. It was the physiotherapy session that changed something. She hadn't meant to see it. She was crossing through the ground floor hallway to the kitchen when she heard it. Not sounds of distress but of effort. Real, deep, grinding effort. The kind that lives below the throat, below the chest. She slowed, because her body slowed before her mind could instruct it otherwise. And through the gap of the physiotherapy room door, she saw him. He was at the parallel bars. Choi was not there. This was not a scheduled session. Jae-won was alone, in a grey t-shirt, and he was making his way along the bars with a concentration so total and so private that it felt intrusive to witness. His jaw was set. His arms bore most of his weight. His left leg moved, then his right, then stalled. He stopped, breathed through it, pushed again. He made it to the end of the bars, turned, looked up, saw her. The silence was immediate and absolute. His expression closed like a shutter, fast, practiced, the armor slamming back into place with a speed that told her exactly how long he'd been maintaining it, and how much energy it required. His hands tightened on the bars. His chin lifted in that way that means, "You were not supposed to see this." She didn't say that was incredible. She didn't say "You're doing so well" or "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stare," or any of the things that would have made the moment smaller by wrapping it in comfort. She walked to the small table beside the door, where a glass of water had been sitting untouched since Choi's earlier session. Picked it up. Walked to the end of the bars. Set it on the ledge within his reach. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen without a word. She heard behind her the faint sound of him picking up the glass. That was all. But something in the house felt different after that. Not warmer, exactly. Not softer. More like a window had been opened somewhere. Not wide, just slightly, just barely, just enough to let in the first thread of outside air. The kind of change you don't name because naming it feels like pressing too hard on something that is only just beginning to hold. Let's pause here for a second. Jae-won has spent 14 months keeping the world at arm's length, and Amara just walked past every wall he built without even raising her voice. Have you ever had someone show up for you quietly, without making a big deal of it, and it hit harder than any grand gesture ever could? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. The power went out on a Thursday night. Not dramatically, no storm, no crack of thunder, no cinematic darkness crashing down. Just a quiet, sudden absence of light, the way a conversation sometimes stops mid-sentence. And then the house was dark and very still, and from somewhere deep in the building's mechanical heart came a low, failed hum, the backup generator attempting and not quite managing. Amara was in the library. She had been reading for the better part of 2 hours, sitting cross-legged in the reading chair with her knees tucked up and a blanket pulled around her shoulders against the house's aggressive air conditioning. And when the lamp went out, she sat in the sudden dark for a moment, blinking, letting her eyes attempt the adjustment. No use. The curtains were thick, the night outside was overcast, and there was simply no light to be had. She heard movement in the hallway. The soft, rubber-on marble sound of wheels approaching, deliberate and unhurried. A beam of torchlight appeared under the door, and then the door opened, and J1 was there with a flashlight in one hand and the expression of a man who had come to address a practical problem and was mildly annoyed to find the problem already occupied by a person. "The generator relay trips sometimes," he said. "It needs to be reset from the basement panel. Mrs. Yoon is visiting her sister. And Mr. Hon gone at 3. As always." Amara unwrapped herself from the blanket and stood. "I'll go. You don't know where the basement panel is. Then tell me." A pause. The flashlight's beam held steady between them. "It's easier to show you," he said, in the tone of someone making a logistical decision, not an offer of company. "All right," she said. The basement was reached through a door off the kitchen, stone steps that J1 navigated in his wheelchair via a narrow lift installed along the left wall, a piece of engineering so seamlessly integrated that she almost missed it. She walked alongside him, and neither of them spoke, their way lit by the single flashlight casting long, uncertain shadows up the stone walls. The basement itself was clean and climate-controlled, the house's infrastructure arranged with the same precise logic as everything above it. Water systems, electrical panels, and a wine cellar behind a glass door that held bottles she estimated cost more than 3 months of the allowance she'd been given. She followed the flashlight to the correct panel. He talked her through it, calmly, technically, and without condescension. She did what he said. The lights came back on. "Thank you," she said. "You did it," he said. "Matter of fact." They stood in the sudden brightness of the basement, and the obvious next move was up the stairs and back to their separate corners of the house. But something had settled over the moment. Some quality of the late hour and the unusual darkness they'd shared and the particular intimacy of basements, which are where houses keep their real selves, and neither of them moved immediately. Amara looked at the wine cellar. "Do you ever drink any of it?" He followed her gaze. "Occasionally. Alone." A pause. "Usually." She looked at him then. Not with pity. She had learned already that pity was the fastest way to close him. Just with the direct, level regard she'd brought into this house from the very first day. "That seems like a waste," she said. "Of good wine and of evenings." Something moved in his face. Not the shutter snap of before. Something slower. More reluctant. "You drink wine?" he asked. "I've had it twice in my life," she said, completely honestly. "But I think that's more about circumstance than preference." And somehow, she couldn't have explained the exact mechanism of it afterward, only that it felt inevitable once it happened. They were sitting in the basement on 2 of the low wooden stools kept there for cellar access, with a bottle of something that J1 selected without comment from the 3rd row and 2 glasses, and the clean bright light of a basement that had never been designed for conversation but was managing it anyway. He poured. She held her glass the way people do when they are not accustomed to holding wine glasses, carefully, with conscious attention, and he noticed, and said nothing about it, which she appreciated more than she could have articulated. She drank. It tasted like dark fruit and would smoke and something almost painful at the back of the throat. "It's good," she said, slightly surprised. "It's a 2009 Burgundy," he said. "It should be good." It was obscenely expensive. How do you know what obscenely expensive wine tastes like versus regular expensive wine? He looked at her. "Practice." "That's a very sad answer." "It's an accurate one." She turned the glass in her hands. The basement was quiet around them. Somewhere in the building's pipes, water moved with a faint, subterranean sound. She thought about her small room near the generator in Lagos, the heat coming up through the floorboards, the noise, the journal hidden beneath. She thought about how completely elsewhere she was right now from anything she had ever known or expected to know. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked at her with the careful expression of someone who has learned that this question is almost always a warning. You're going to regardless, he said. The terrace, she said. You're always back inside before sunset. Every day. Why? The silence that followed had a different quality than the others. Denser. More interior. His hands, she noticed, had stilled on his glass. You notice things, he said. Not an accusation. Something more complicated. I've had to, she said simply, and left the truth of that to sit without explanation, because she thought he was probably intelligent enough to hear what it meant. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. Then he said, very evenly, the accident happened at sunset. In Busan. I was driving back from a meeting. The road was elevated, you could see the city from it, and the water beyond it. It was. He stopped. Beautiful, actually. For about 4 seconds. And then the car in front lost control, and the railing gave, and... He stopped again. Set his glass down on the stone floor beside the stool. I don't enjoy sunsets anymore. Amara sat with that. She didn't try to fix it. Didn't offer the useless comfort of I'm sorry, or the even more useless comfort of I'm sure it'll get better. She just let the truth of it be in the room with them without rushing to cover it with something softer. After a moment, she said, my mother used to love sunsets. He looked at her. She'd stop whatever she was doing, Amara said. Cooking, cleaning, whatever. She'd just stop, and go to the window, and stand there until it was done. She said. Amara paused, and the pause had memory in it, the particular weight of recalling someone's exact words. She said that sunsets were God showing off. That you'd have to be very ungrateful not to stop and look. Quiet. She sounds, Jae-won said carefully, like someone worth knowing. She was the best person I've ever met, Amara said. She was also the only person who ever made me feel like I was worth something. And she's been gone 3 years, and sometimes, she stopped. Looked at the wine in her glass. Sometimes the world makes a lot more sense with her in it. The basement held the words gently. Jae-won did not offer condolences. He said, what was her name? Abina, Amara said. And the name in her mouth was its own kind of prayer. The same way she said you will not be this forever, but softer, more ancient, made of grief and love so intertwined they had become a single substance. Abina, he repeated quietly, as if learning it properly. She looked at him. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not warmth exactly, but the precursor to it. The thawing before the warmth. The moment just before the frost gives way. What about you? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, my mother left when I was 11. My father replaced her within a year with someone more convenient and never mentioned her again. I learned very early that people in my world are valued for their function. When your function changes, his eyes moved to his wheelchair, briefly, then back, so does your value. That's not true, Amara said immediately, with a directness that seemed to surprise him. It has been consistently true in my experience, he said. Your experience has been with the wrong people, she said. And she said it with such simple, matter-of-fact certainty, not as comfort, not as consolation, but as plain observable fact, that he had absolutely nothing to say in response. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached for his glass and drank, and looked away, and she could see the edge of something moving across his profile, something that had no name yet but was learning one. She found the photograph 3 days later. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been asked by Mrs. Yoon to retrieve a document from Jae-won's office while he was in a meeting, a straightforward errand, nothing more. The document was where Mrs. Yoon said it would be, on the corner of the desk. She picked it up, and as she turned to go, something on the bookshelf caught her eye. A photograph in a plain dark frame, set slightly behind a row of books, as if it had been placed there deliberately out of sight but not quite far enough out of sight, the way you put something you can't bring yourself to look at but also can't bring yourself to put away. She should have left. She crossed to the shelf, looked at the photograph. It was Jae-won, younger, mid-20s perhaps, before the weight of everything had settled in his jaw and made his eyes that shade of deep and careful. He was standing on 2 feet, in the full, unconsidered way of someone who has never thought about standing, who has no relationship with the act because it has never cost them anything. He was at what looked like a harbor, boats behind him, water, that particular quality of open coastal light. His head was tilted back slightly, laughing at something off camera. A real laugh. The kind that takes up the whole face. He looked, and this was the word that arrived before she could choose a better one, free. She stood there looking at it for longer than she should have, feeling something calmly shift inside her, that things shift when you understand something new about a person, not information, exactly, but dimension. When someone stops being a collection of behaviors and becomes, undeniably, a human being with a before and an after, with a laugh they no longer use, with a harbor somewhere that holds the version of them that still existed before the world got to them. She put the photograph back carefully, exactly as she had found it. But she carried it with her for the rest of the day. Carried his laugh in that coastal light. Carried the way his whole face had changed with it. Carried the ache of understanding what had been taken from him, and why he had built so many walls to avoid feeling the size of the loss. That evening at dinner, she looked at him across the 12 feet of polished table and she thought, I am in serious trouble. She ate her fish last. He didn't eat the mushrooms. Neither of them said a word about any of it. It started with music. Not intentionally. Nothing real ever starts intentionally. Amara had not planned to be in the kitchen at 11 on a Friday night, and she had certainly not planned to be dancing. It had simply happened the way things happen when you have been careful and controlled and tightly managed for too many consecutive days, and your body, without consulting you, decides it has had enough of all that. She had come down for tea. That was the whole plan. Kettle, cup, tea bag, back upstairs. But Mr. Han had left the small Bluetooth speaker on the counter, the one he played Korean ballads through while he cooked, and on impulse she had connected her phone to it, and found the song she always went to when she needed to remember that she was still in there, still herself, still the girl her mother had raised before the world had gotten so heavy. An old Ghanaian highlife song. Her mother's song, really, the one Abina used to play on Sunday mornings while she cooked jollof, moving around the small kitchen with the unself-conscious joy of a woman completely at home in her own body, completely at home in her own life. Amara turned the volume up just enough. And then, because no one was watching and the house was asleep and she was very, very far from home and had been holding herself together for weeks with both hands, she began to move. Nothing elaborate. No performance. Just the quiet, private language of a body remembering something it had almost forgotten. Hips, shoulders, the slight lift of her arms, her eyes closed. Her feet finding the rhythm on the kitchen tiles the way water finds the path of least resistance. Natural. Inevitable. Hers. She didn't hear the soft roll of wheels stop in the kitchen doorway. Jae-won had come down for water. He would maintain this internally, with great conviction, for several days afterward. He had come for water. He had simply come for water, and the kitchen was simply in that direction, and he had simply arrived at the doorway at that particular moment through no design of his own. What he found was Amara. She was dancing with her eyes closed in the low light of the kitchen, her phone on the counter playing something warm and rhythmic that he didn't recognize, brass and percussion, and a guitar doing something intricate underneath it all. She was wearing a loose yellow sleep shirt, and her hair was out for the first time since she'd arrived, a soft, full cloud of it moving with her. She was not performing. She was not even aware of being seen. She was simply, completely, devastatingly herself. He had not moved for a long time. He could not have said, with any precision, what he felt watching her. He was not accustomed to the feeling. It was something that lived below the vocabulary he had built for his interior life, which was a vocabulary almost exclusively composed of clinical terms and strategic language, and the grammar of control. This was none of those things. This was something older and less manageable. This was the specific ache of witnessing someone be free when you have forgotten what freedom feels like. She opened her eyes. Saw him. The music kept playing. She didn't stop it. Didn't apologize. Didn't clutch at embarrassment, or wrap herself in self-consciousness. She met his eyes across the kitchen with that same direct, uncurated gaze she'd brought to every moment between them, and after 3 full seconds she said, with complete composure, "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," he said. "That's a very unhelpful answer. I thought so too, but it was the honest one." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached over and turned the volume down, not off, just down, the song still breathing softly in the kitchen between them. She leaned against the counter. "My mother used to dance to this song," she said. "Every Sunday. Without fail." "I could tell," he said. She tilted her head. "What could you tell?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you weren't dancing your dance," he said carefully. "You were dancing hers." The kitchen went very still. Amara looked at him with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession. Surprise, and then the particular vulnerability of being correctly seen, and then something softer and more open than anything he had witnessed on her face before. Her eyes had gone slightly bright in a way she was clearly not going to acknowledge, and he was clearly not going to comment on, because they had both, without discussion, developed an instinct for which truths needed space and which ones needed silence. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was." After that, something loosened. Not all at once. Nothing between them happened all at once. But the quality of the house changed in the days that followed in the way that air changes before rain. Imperceptibly at first, and then undeniably. Dinner at 7 became less of an endurance and more of a thing that both of them, without discussing it, stopped looking for reasons to shorten. He started talking. Not much. Not the way people talk when they've decided to be known, but the way people talk when they've stopped deciding not to be. Small things at first. A comment about something he'd read. An observation about a business problem delivered in the tone of someone who was thinking aloud rather than performing competence. Once, a dry, barely there observation about one of the household's more eccentric deliveries that was so unexpectedly funny that Amara put her fork down and laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound of it in the formal dining room seemed to surprise the room itself. He watched her laugh with an expression that would have been unreadable to anyone who hadn't been paying close attention. Amara had been paying very close attention. She started teaching him words in Chui, her mother's language, the one she still thought in when she was tired or emotional or very happy. It began because he'd asked, offhandedly, what the High Life song was saying, and she translated it phrase by phrase while they sat on the terrace one evening. She had noticed he'd stopped retreating indoors before sunset, had started staying for the last few minutes of it while looking determinately at his tea rather than the sky, which she counted as quiet, hard-won progress. And somewhere in the translation, he'd repeated one of the words with such precise, serious attention to the pronunciation that she had to work very hard not to find it completely endearing. "Do," she said. "It means love. But it also means..." She paused, looking for it. "It means a specific kind of love." The kind that costs you something. He repeated it. Got it almost right. Close, she said. Again, he said. She said it again. He said it again. And they sat on the terrace with the sun going down in layers of amber and rose behind the city. And he was looking at the sky now, she noticed, and did not say so. And the word moved between them in the cooling air like something that had been waiting a long time to be learned. One night he showed her the harbor photograph himself. She had not told him she had seen it, had said nothing, carried it alone the way she decided to. But he came to the library where she was reading, and he had it in his hand. And he set it on the side table beside her chair without preamble and said, "That was Busan. 2 years before the accident, I just finalized the acquisition of my 4th company." He looked at the photograph. "I don't remember what was funny." Amara looked at the photograph. Then at him. "You look free," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "I was careless," he said. "I thought free and careless were the same thing." "Maybe they're allowed to be sometimes," she said. "Not everything has to be the lesson." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down in the space beside the reading chair, just sat in his wheelchair, beside her chair, the photograph between them on the table, and they read in companionable silence for the better part of an hour. And at some point she looked up and he was not reading. He was looking at the photograph with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not grief. Not longing. Something quieter. Something almost like permission. She looked back at her book. Gave it space. Do, she thought, without meaning to. The kind that costs you something. She turned the page. And outside, the city glittered and hummed, and the house that had felt like a fortress was breathing differently now. Slower, softer, something shifting deep in its structure the way old buildings shift in the heat of the day. Settling. Making room. But somewhere in Lagos, a flight was being booked. And Vivian Osemensa, who had a gift for arriving at exactly the wrong moment, was deciding it was time to collect what she'd thrown away. Vivian arrived on a Wednesday morning without warning. That was deliberate. Amara understood this immediately, not as paranoia but as pattern recognition, the specific skill you develop after years of living with someone who uses surprise as a weapon. Vivian had always preferred to arrive before you had time to arrange your face. Amara was in the garden when the car came through the gate. She had taken to spending mornings out there. The garden had a section near the south wall where someone had planted birds of paradise at some point in the house's history, tall and vivid and slightly wild against the precision of everything surrounding them, and she found them privately sustaining in a way she hadn't tried to analyze. She was sitting on the low stone bench beside them with her journal open on her knee when she heard the gate and looked up and felt the bottom drop out of the morning. Vivian stepped out of the car in a cream silk blouse and caramel trousers and sunglasses she removed with deliberate slowness, surveying the property with the relaxed proprietary air of someone returning to a place they consider theirs. She was, objectively, stunning. She was also, Amara knew with the bone-deep certainty of shared history, here to do damage. Their eyes met across the garden. Vivian smiled. The kind of smile that has no warmth in it, all surface and edges, like something decorative made from glass. "Amara," she said, as if mildly surprised. As if they had run into each other in a market. "You look well." "Vivian," Amara said, keeping her voice level, keeping everything level. "Is he inside?" There was no need to specify who. "Yes," Amara said. Vivian was already walking toward the house. Amara stayed in the garden for 20 minutes. She told herself it was because she was not the kind of woman who followed people into rooms out of anxiety. She told herself it was composure. Discipline. The long-practiced art of not showing what was moving beneath the surface. She was also, under all of that, afraid. Not of Vivian. Not exactly. Of what Vivian knew. Of the specific, targeted intelligence of a woman who had watched Amara her entire life and understood, with the precision of someone who has studied a person the way you study a threat, exactly where the soft places were. She went inside after 20 minutes. She found them in the main reception room. J1 was by the window, his default position, she had come to understand, for conversations he wanted to feel in control of. Vivian was on the settee with her ankles crossed and her handbag on her knee, arranged with the careful artistry of someone who has thought about how she looks in every room she enters. The air between them was the specific kind of charged that meant the conversation had already established its territory before Amara arrived. "There she is," Vivian said, turning with that smile again. "I was just telling J1 how much I've been thinking about all of this. How worried I've been." "Worried," Amara repeated. "About you, of course." Vivian tilted her head with practiced sincerity. "It's a lot of pressure, isn't it? Being dropped into." A small, delicate gesture at the room, at J1, at the general enormity of everything. All of this, with no preparation, no experience of this world. "I'm managing," Amara said. "You are," Vivian agreed warmly. "That's what I told Daddy, actually. I said, Amara is resourceful. She's always known how to make the best of a situation. How to find the opportunity in it." The word opportunity landed in the room with a very specific weight. Amara looked at her steadily, saying nothing. Vivian turned to J1 with an expression of gentle, regretful concern. The expression of someone about to say something difficult because they care too much not to. "I actually came because I felt I owed you the truth," she said. "About why my father chose Amara specifically." J1's face was still, unreadable, but his eyes had sharpened. "Vivian," Amara said. "She's been trying to get out of our family's house for years," Vivian said, softly, sorrowfully, the words arranged with the beautiful precision of a blade. "She had no money, no prospects, and no way out. When this arrangement came up, she volunteered, J1. I want you to know that. My father didn't have to force her. She saw what you had and what you are, and she asked to come. She thought it was her chance." A pause, perfectly timed. I couldn't let you go on not knowing. Whatever has developed here, between the two of you, I think you deserve to know what it was built on." The silence that followed was enormous. Amara stood in the center of it, feeling the specific, nauseating sensation of truth being taken apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. Because there was just enough reality in Vivian's words to make the lie inside them harder to find. Yes, she had needed out. Yes, she had seen the arrangement as a door. She had written those exact words in her journal on the night before she left. Her journal that she kept under her pillow in this house because there were no loose floorboards here and she hadn't found a better place yet. Her journal. She looked at Vivian. Saw, in the microscopic flicker of satisfaction behind those careful eyes, exactly what had happened. Exactly when. Exactly how. J1, Amara said, turning to him. Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. "That's not." "Is it true?" he said. Quiet. Completely, terrifyingly quiet. "Not the way she's." "Is any of it true?" His eyes were on her now, and they were not the eyes she had come to know. Not the eyes that had learned dew on the terrace, that had watched her dance her mother's dance, that had sat beside her in the library and slowly, privately, begun to open. These were the other eyes. The ones from the very first day. Flat, precise, and sealed. "I did see it as a way out," she said, because she would not lie to him. She had decided that from the beginning. and she would not change it now under pressure, not even this pressure. I was trapped and I needed out, and yes, I thought, I hoped, this could be something that changed my life. But that is not all it became, and you know that. You have been here for every moment of what it became. You know what's real. I know what I was shown, he said. The words hit like a hand across the face. What you were shown, she repeated. A performance designed to secure a comfortable life. His voice was even and measured, the tone he used for boardroom conclusions, the tone that meant the decision had been made and what followed was merely administrative. You are talented, Amara. I'll give you that. I have had people try to get close to me my entire life for what I have, and most of them are significantly less convincing. Stop, she said, quietly. Stop right now, and think about what you're saying. I think I'm being remarkably clear. You're being remarkably foolish. The word came out before she could moderate it, not cruel, but direct, and it cracked something in the room's atmosphere. You are right there, right in front of me, choosing to believe the person who abandoned you over the person who has been here every single day, who has never asked you for a single thing you didn't offer, who sat in a basement with you and told you about her mother, and who has never. Her voice caught, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, who has never once treated you like you were broken. And you are choosing her, because she's given you the version of me that is easiest to dismiss. J1 looked at her. His jaw was tight. Something was moving behind his eyes. She could see it, the conflict of it, the way truth and pride were fighting each other in the space behind his face. And for one moment she thought he was going to come back. To choose correctly. To step back from the ledge. Then Vivian shifted on the settee and said, almost gently, I did find her journal, J1. I can show you what she wrote. And he looked away from Amara. That was all. Just away. You should take some time, he said to the window. Mrs. Yoon will arrange. Don't, Amara said. Her voice had gone very quiet. The quietest she'd been in this entire conversation. The kind of quiet that happens when something inside you makes a decision. Don't arrange anything. Don't manage this. Say what you mean. A long silence. I think it would be better, he said, with the specific, devastating courtesy of a man who has learned to inflict maximum damage through minimum emotion, if you return to Lagos. The room was perfectly still. Somewhere outside the window, the birds of paradise stood in the garden, tall and vivid and unchanged. Amara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the back of his head, because he was still facing the window, because he couldn't quite bring himself to say it to her face, and some small, observant part of her noted that and held it, even now, even in this. Then she turned. She walked past Vivian without looking at her. She walked up the stairs. She went to her room. She opened the dark green carry-on bag that still had Vivian's initials on the luggage tag, because she had never gotten around to removing them, and she began to fold her things into it with careful, deliberate hands. Her mother's gold earrings she wrapped in a piece of tissue, the journal she put in last, on top of everything, and then stopped and looked at it for a moment. Took it back out. Opened it to the last blank page. Sat on the edge of the bed and wrote. For 7 minutes, she wrote without stopping, without correcting, without managing. Just wrote the way you write when there is no one left to perform composure for and the truth has no reason anymore to stay inside. Then she capped the pen, closed the journal, and left it on the bed. Not forgotten, not careless. Left. The bag was light in her hand. It had always been light, she had arrived with so little, and she was leaving with the same amount. She walked through the house that had been, for a brief and extraordinary season, something close to a home. And she did not slow down at the library door, and she did not look at the terrace, and she did not look at the kitchen where she had danced a mother's dance while someone watched from a doorway and understood exactly what they were seeing. She walked out of the front door, got into a car, and behind her, on the 43rd floor of a building he owned, in a room that was now full of exactly the silence he had always said he preferred, Kong Jae-won sat at his window and looked at his city and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something he recognized. Not rage. Not the clean, manageable fury of business and control. Something older and more honest and far more terrible. The specific weight of a man who has just destroyed the only true thing in his life with both hands and known it precisely, in real time, even as he was doing it, and done it anyway. Because he was afraid. And had not yet learned that fear is not the same as wisdom. The house was exactly what he had always said he wanted. Quiet. Ordered. Undisturbed. Every surface in its correct place. Every room operating on its proper schedule. No unexpected music from the kitchen at 11 o'clock. No one in his library at 1:30. No yellow sleep shirt moving through his peripheral vision at unexpected hours. No voice across 12 feet of dinner table saying things like "that's a very sad answer" with the matter-of-fact candor of someone who has decided that honesty is the only currency worth spending. Just the house. Just the silence. Just him. Jae-won sat at his office desk and looked at the open laptop in front of him and read the same paragraph of the same financial report 4 times without absorbing a single word of it. Vivian had left an hour after Amara. He had not asked her to stay. She had gathered her bag and her sunglasses and her careful, satisfied composure and said something about being glad they'd had the chance to clear the air. And he had said nothing. And the door had closed behind her. And the house had settled into its new silence like a body after the last breath. He had told himself in those first hours that he felt relief. He was practiced enough at internal dishonesty to sustain this for almost 40 minutes. Then it collapsed. The way things built on false foundations always eventually collapse. Not with drama, but with the quiet, structural certainty of something that was never going to hold. And what was underneath the relief was not the vindicated clarity he had expected. What was underneath was something he hadn't felt since a rain-slicked road in Busan, and the particular, helpless silence of falling. He pushed back from the desk, wheeled himself to the window. Seoul was doing what it always did, being enormous and indifferent and lit from within. A city of 10 million people, none of whom were looking up at the 43rd floor, where a man was trying to locate, with increasing desperation, the feeling of being right about something. He couldn't find it. Choi arrived at 7 the following morning for the scheduled session. He set up the parallel bars with his usual efficiency, made his notes on his clipboard, and waited. Jae-won came in and positioned himself at the start of the bars and stared at them for a long moment without moving. "She left," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Choi looked up from his clipboard, said nothing, waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that some information is delivered not for response but for witness. "I told her to go," Jae-won said. Choi made a small, non-committal sound. "She was using me." He said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing, with a slight overemphasis of a line that has been repeated internally so many times it has started to sound less like truth and more like an argument. Choi set his clipboard down. This was unusual enough that Jae-won looked at him. "Mr. Kong," Choi said carefully, in the tone of a man who has decided that the professional boundary he is about to cross is worth the cost. "In 14 months, I have come to this house 3 mornings a week. In the first 8 of those months, you completed your sessions, and I left. And the house was exactly the same when I arrived as when I departed. In the last 6 weeks," he paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone who does not waste them, "the house has been different. You have been different." Jae-won said nothing. "You did 9 reps 2 weeks ago, Choi said. You have never done more than 7 before that day. You didn't mention it. You didn't even seem to notice. You were talking about something else entirely. A pause. You were talking about Chui. The word landed softly in the room. J1 looked at the parallel bars. Start the session, Choi, he said. Choi picked up his clipboard. Yes, sir, he said. And then, so quietly it was almost not said at all. The person who made you do 9 reps deserves better than whatever you told yourself this morning. He said nothing further. Neither did J1. But he did 10 reps that morning. And on the 9th one, when his left leg threatened to fail and everything in him screamed to stop, he heard, involuntarily, helplessly, with the specificity of something that has embedded itself too deep to be evicted, her voice. You know what's real. He finished the 10th rep. It was Mrs. Yoon who brought him the journal. She appeared in the doorway of his office at 2:30 that same afternoon, the small, worn notebook held in both hands, the way you carry something that belongs to someone else, with the careful neutrality of a person who is delivering an object, not making a statement. Except that Mrs. Yoon, who had been in this house for 11 years and had never once offered an unsolicited opinion, set the journal on his desk and then folded her hands in front of her and said, She left this on the bed. I don't believe it was an accident. J1 looked at the journal. Dark blue cover, slightly worn at the corners, the edges of the pages soft with use. He had seen it in her hands on various evenings and had noted it the way he noted everything about her, cataloguing without intending to. She wouldn't want me to read it, he said. She left it on the bed, Mr. Kong, Mrs. Yoon said, with the serene patience of a woman who has made her point and is content to let it stand. Not in the bag. Not in the drawer. On the bed. She left the room. He looked at the journal for a long time without touching it. Outside, Seoul moved through its afternoon, the light shifting, the shadows lengthening, the sun beginning its slow, inevitable descent toward the skyline. Sunset. He watched it. Really watched, for the first time in 14 months, without turning away. It was not beautiful in the devastating way of the Busan harbor in the photograph. It was a city sunset, layered with smog and refracted by glass and steel into something complicated and impure and genuinely, unexpectedly lovely. Sunsets are God showing off, Abina had apparently said. You'd have to be very ungrateful not to stop and look. He looked at it until it was done. Then he picked up the journal. He did not read the private pages. He was precise about this, opening it from the back to the last written page, the one dated the morning she had left, in her careful, deliberate handwriting. He read only that page. Only what she had left for whoever came to the bed and found it, which she had known. He understood with complete certainty, would be him. He read it once. Then again. She had not written an accusation. She had not written a plea. What she had written was this. I came here with nothing, and I was honest about that from the first day. I told you I would not make myself furniture again, and I didn't. I told you your experience had been with the wrong people, and I meant it. I still mean it. What I didn't tell you, because it wasn't mine to say until it was ready, is that somewhere between the basement and the terrace and the library at 1:30 in the morning, I stopped thinking of this house as a place I was surviving. I started thinking of it as a place I was living. There is a difference. You know there is a difference. You also know the difference between what Vivian said and what is true. You are the most precise person I have ever met. You do not miss things. You did not miss this. So I'm not angry. I'm not, even if I'm honest, surprised. Not because I expected you to fail, but because I understand what it costs you to trust someone. I understand it the way I understand what it costs to let someone see you. We both know that cost. I just thought you should know. The thing you're afraid of isn't real, but it is real. The most real thing that has happened to me in a very long time. My mother would have liked you. She had a talent for seeing people beneath what they showed the world. I think I have inherited it. Take care of yourself. J1. Do 10 reps. Amara. He closed the journal. Sat in the silence for a long time. 3 days passed. He would not have been able to account for them clearly afterward. They existed in his memory as a single, continuous state of interior weather. He worked. He slept badly. He did his physiotherapy, 10 reps every morning, without being told, without Choi saying anything about it. Both of them simply acknowledging it in the silent language of men who understand that some things don't need commentary. He ate dinner alone at the long table and did not look at the chair 12 feet away, and was not successful at not looking at it. He read her journal entry 6 more times over those 3 days. Not the private pages. Only that last one. Only what she had meant for him to find. On the 3rd night, he sat at his desk for a long time with his phone in his hand, turning it over and over in a way that was entirely unlike him. And then he called his assistant. I need to travel, he said. A pause. His assistant, who had been with him for 4 years and had arranged everything from hostile corporate takeovers to 3 separate governmental inquiries and had never once sounded surprised. Sounded, very slightly, surprised. Travel, sir. Lagos, he said. Tomorrow. Arrange what's needed. Another pause. Sir, the accessibility requirements alone will take. Then start now, he said. Quietly. Completely without impatience. I have somewhere I need to be. He set the phone down. Looked at the journal on his desk. Thought about a woman in a garden in Lagos who kept birds of paradise company in the mornings and ate her food in a specific order and danced her dead mother's dance in empty kitchens and had looked at him. From the very first day, from the very first moment, not as a transaction or a tragedy or a man diminished by a wheelchair and a rain-slicked road, but simply, fully, as a person worth knowing. He thought about the word do. The kind that costs you something. He picked up the journal. Put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where it sat for the rest of the night with the warm, specific weight of something that had been entrusted to him. He did not sleep. But for the first time in a very long time, the sleeplessness was not empty. It was full of something he was only just beginning to recognize. Something that had been growing in this house for weeks in the particular stubborn way of things that grow where they are not expected. Finding purchase in the cracks, pushing through without permission, answering to nothing but their own necessity. Outside his window, Seoul glittered and hummed. He was, for the first time in 14 months, not looking at it. He was thinking about Lagos. Lagos received him the way Lagos receives everything, without adjustment, without apology, and without slowing down for anyone. The heat was the first thing. It came through the car window like a living thing, dense and golden and smelling of red earth and exhaust, and somewhere underneath both of those things, something flowering. His assistant had arranged an accessible vehicle, a ground-floor hotel suite, and a driver who spoke English. Everything is managed. Everything is organized. The scaffolding of a man who had spent his entire life ensuring that his environment bent to his requirements rather than the other way around. None of it touched the feeling in his chest. He had not slept on the plane. He had sat at the window through the long overnight flight and watched the dark Atlantic give way, in the grey of early morning, to the West African coastline, and he had thought about the evening she left. The evening before the journal, before Choi, before any of the 3 days of overdue and necessary self-examination that had finally produced something worth acting on. The evening he had sat in the dark of that enormous silent house and called Dae-Young. He had asked him to follow her to Lagos. To keep a respectful distance, Not to approach her, not to interfere, just to make sure she arrived safely and to send him an address when she had settled. Dae-young had said, "Understood, sir," and had done exactly that, with the complete discretion of a man who had been with him long enough to know when something was an order and when something was a trust. The address had come on the second day. One line beneath it. Settled. Safe. Bought flowers from the market this morning. Jae-won had sat with that detail for a long time. He was not going to pretend to himself, not anymore. He was finished pretending to himself that sending Dae-young had been a practical decision. It had been the only thing he could bring himself to do, in that moment. That was not pure abandonment. He had told her to leave, and the words were still in the air, and something in him that was more honest than the rest had simply refused to let her disappear into the world unprotected because of what he had done. It was not control. He had no right to control her. He had forfeited considerable things in that reception room when he looked away from her face. It was the only language of care he had known how to speak, in that moment, before he had found the words for the real one. He had arrived at the hotel by mid-morning. Lagos traffic had done what Lagos traffic does. Magnificent, unrushed, and entirely its own. And by the time the car pulled into the quiet road where she lived, the afternoon had properly established itself. Golden and full and completely indifferent to whatever was about to happen in a courtyard at the end of it. He looked out the window as the car slowed. Thought about a woman who had boarded a plane for the first time in her life with one bag and her mother's earrings and arrived in a country she didn't know to a man who had received her like an inconvenience. He thought about the amount of courage that had required. He thought about how completely, how inexcusably, he had failed to recognize it at the time. The car stopped. He had somewhere he needed to be. She was in the courtyard when she heard the car. She had been watering the birds of paradise, still losing the quiet internal argument about whether buying them had been sentimental and impractical or simply sentimental, which she was beginning to suspect was not the same thing, when she heard an unfamiliar engine slow and stop on the other side of the iron gate. She looked up toward it, set the watering can down, walked to the gate, lifted the latch, pulled it open, and there he was. She went completely still. He was right there, on the other side, in the full blaze of the Lagos afternoon, in a plain dark shirt with his sleeves pushed to the elbows. His hair slightly disordered from what must have been a very long journey. His hands rested on his wheels simply, without the deliberate architectural looseness she had once catalogued as control wearing the costume of ease. Just his hands. Just him. Tired. Honest. Present. The city moved around this moment with complete indifference. A woman calling from a nearby stall, a child running past on some urgent private errand, and the distant pulse of music from somewhere down the street. Lagos did not pause for anyone. It did not need to. The moment was sufficient entirely in itself. They looked at each other across the open gate. It was Amara who spoke first. "How did you find me?" she said. He held her gaze without flinching. "I had someone make sure you got home safely," he said. He kept his distance, didn't approach you, and didn't interfere with anything. "He sent me your address when you had settled." She said nothing immediately. He could see her receiving it, not processing it away, not filing it for later, actually receiving it, the way she received everything, with her full attention and no performance. "Come inside," she said finally. "We need to talk about that." She made tea. Not because the moment called for tea, but because she needed something to do with her hands while she assembled herself. She moved through the small kitchen with the careful, unhurried focus she brought to necessary tasks, and he sat in the main room and looked around it quietly. It was modest and sun-warmed and simply furnished. Nothing designed to impress or signal anything about the person living in it except that they had chosen, carefully, what little they had. A clean table, 2 chairs, a window with a thin cotton curtain lifting gently in the warm afternoon air, and on the windowsill, catching the light like 2 small held flames, her mother's gold earrings. He looked at them for a long moment, said nothing. She came back with 2 cups, saw him looking, and let him have the moment without comment, the way she had always let him have things privately, without turning them into occasions. She set his cup within reach, sat across from him. "Tell me about this person you sent," she said. "His name is De-Jong," he said. "He has been with me 7 years. He is completely discreet, and he did exactly what I asked. Kept his distance, didn't make himself known, and didn't come near you." He held her gaze steadily. "I asked him to do it the evening you left. Before I had read the journal. Before any of it." Amara looked at him. Something was moving through her expression. Not one thing, not simple, not quick. He did not try to rush it or reach across it with an explanation. He waited in the particular way she had taught him, giving it the space it needed to become what it was trying to become. "You had someone follow me," she said. "Watch over you," he said carefully. "I understand the distinction may not feel significant from where you are." "It does feel significant," she said. "That is what I am working out." She set her cup down, looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "I spent 6 years in a house where everything I did was observed, where I had no privacy, no space that was mine, no moment that wasn't watched by someone who wanted something from it." Her voice was quiet and completely level. "When I left Seoul I had, for the first time in a very long time, the feeling of being entirely my own, of belonging to no one's awareness but my own." She held his gaze. "And now you are telling me that was not entirely true." "Yes," he said, without qualification, without reaching for explanation as a shield. "Why?" she said. Not an accusation. A real question. The most direct question she knew how to ask, and she asked it fully, without softening it for his comfort. "Because I could not stop," he said plainly. "I told you to leave," and the words were still in the air, and something in me that was more honest than everything else I was feeling in that moment. He paused. "Refused to let you disappear into the world unprotected because of what I had done. I had no right to you. I knew that. But I could not make myself not care what happened to you. Even then. Even at my worst." The room was very quiet. She sat with it fully. All of it, the discomfort of it and the complicated, inconvenient thing underneath the discomfort. She was honest enough, and had spent enough time in the last several days being rigorously honest with herself to name that thing clearly in her own mind. The Ose Mensa house had watched her as property, as something to be managed and contained. She had known it in her body, the specific, suffocating weight of being observed by people who saw her as a problem to be controlled. This was not that. She knew the difference. Had always known the difference between those 2 kinds of watching. Had simply never, before this moment, been the object of the second kind. "You sent him before the journal," she said slowly. "Before Choi came. Before any of the reflection that brought you here. You were still." She paused, choosing the precise word. "You were still in the middle of everything you had told yourself to believe. And you still sent someone." "Yes," he said. She nodded once, a small, slow nod that meant she had arrived somewhere. Not forgiveness yet. Understanding first. The thing that has to come before forgiveness can be honest rather than performative. "All right," she said. "Tell me the rest." He told her, not with the elegant, managed precision of a man constructing an argument, but with the particular stripped quality of someone who has decided that the truth is the only thing left worth spending. He told her about the 3 days. About reading her journal entry in the last light of a sunset. He had finally, for the first time in 14 months, allowed himself to watch. About Choi arriving the next morning and saying the thing about the 9 reps that neither of them discussed further because neither of them needed to. About doing 10 reps every morning since it was the only form of conversation available to him and he had taken it. About sitting at his desk on the 3rd night and understanding, with the same precision he brought to everything, now finally turned honestly inward, exactly what he had done and exactly why. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out without cushioning, without the boardroom language he might once have used to make a concession sound like a strategy. Just the plain, undefended fact of it. "I was wrong about what you were. I was wrong to listen to Vivian. I was wrong to look away from your face when you were telling me the truth, because looking away was easier than believing that I deserved what you were offering." A breath. "And I was afraid. I have been afraid in one form or another since I was 11 years old and learned that the people who are supposed to stay leave. And rather than examine that, I built a life so self-sufficient that the fear would never have occasion to be relevant." He looked at her steadily. "And then you walked into that house with one bag and your mother's earrings and made the fear relevant. By being someone I did not want to lose. And I handled that." The faintest pause. With stunning stupidity. "You chose her version of me," Amara said quietly. "Over everything you had actually witnessed." "Yes." "You looked away from my face." "Yes." "When I was standing right there telling you the truth." "Yes." His voice did not waver, did not reach for softening or context. "I looked away because you were telling me something true and I was not yet ready to receive it. And I am sorry, Amara." He held her gaze with the full, unmanaged directness that was, she understood now, the most natural thing about him when he wasn't working to suppress it. "Not as a formality. Not as a step toward something I want. I am sorry because I knew better and chose worse. And you are the last person who deserved that from me or from anyone." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she said. He waited. "It wasn't that you believed her," she said. "It was that you already had everything you needed, not to. You were there, J1. For all of it. The basement. The terrace. The library at 1:30 in the morning. You heard what I said, and you saw what I didn't do. I never asked you for a single thing you hadn't offered. I never tried to make you into something easier." Her voice was steady and even and completely without performance. "You had all of that. And you still chose the version of me that was easiest to dismiss. Because that version let you stay safe." He said nothing. Because she was right. Because she was exactly, completely right. And he was a man who had spent his entire life valuing precision and was not going to insult her now by arguing against it. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I did." The afternoon moved through the room in long, warm panels of light. Outside, Lagos continued its magnificent, indifferent business. A radio somewhere was playing something with a slow, steady rhythm, not quite the bright brass of high life, something quieter, more interior. "I don't know how to be the person you deserve," he said. "I want to be honest about that rather than make you a promise I don't yet know how to keep. I am." A breath. "I am not a finished thing. I have a significant history of choosing wrong and a deeply ingrained habit of deciding that need is weakness." He looked at her. "But I am here. In this room. In a city that has not arranged itself for me, that I had no framework for navigating, that I came to anyway because—" He stopped. Then simply, "Because the alternative was the house." And the house without you in it is just a building. I have lived in buildings. I did not know until you left that I had briefly lived in something else entirely. She looked at him across the small table. At this man who had crossed 12,000 kilometers with no guarantee of how it would end. Who had arrived at her gate with no power over what came next. No strategy for what happened if she said no. Nothing in his hands except himself, finally and entirely unarmored. Slowly, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his where it rested on the table's surface. He looked down at her hand on his, then up at her face. "Do," she said softly. Her mother's word. The one she had taught him on a terrace at sunset, in another life that was also this life. The kind that costs you something. The only kind she had ever believed was real. He turned his hand beneath hers so that his palm faced up, and held on. "Do," he said. His pronunciation was perfect. She noticed immediately, felt it move through her like the opening bars of a Sunday morning song. She said nothing about it, kept it quietly, and held it the way you hold something you have been given that you did not expect. There was time to tell him. For the first time in a very long time, for both of them, there was time for everything. They moved to the courtyard as the afternoon began its slow descent toward evening. He told her about the 10th rep. About the way the parallel bars had looked different afterward, not like an endurance to be survived, but like something that was going somewhere. She told him about the market vendor who had thrown in an extra bird of paradise because she had admired them with too much feeling to convincingly pretend she was only browsing. He laughed. A real laugh, full and unhurried, rising from somewhere unguarded, taking up his whole face without asking permission. She had seen it once before in a photograph tucked behind a row of books, in a harbor she had never visited, on the face of a man who had not yet learned to be so careful with himself. She thought, there he is. She thought, there he has always been, underneath all of it, waiting. The sun went down over Lagos in the way it always did, slowly, generously, in layers of amber and rose, and then the deep extraordinary blue of a tropical evening sky with nowhere better to be. It was not the clean, open sunset of a harbor in Busan. It was a Lagos sunset, complicated and impure, refracted through heat and humidity and the particular texture of this city's air into something that had absolutely no business being as beautiful as it was. Showing off, her mother would have said, with the specific satisfaction of someone whose point has just been conclusively proven. You would have to be very ungrateful not to stop and look. They stopped. They looked. Neither of them went inside. The birds of paradise stood beside them in the last of the evening light, tall, vivid, entirely themselves, growing exactly where they had not been expected to. His hand found hers in the cooling air. Not reaching, not grasping, simply finding the way you find in the dark, something you already know the shape of. She held on. You will not be this forever. She had told herself every morning for years on a wooden stool in a room that was never hers. She had said it like a prayer, like a promise she was making to someone she hadn't yet met. She understood now who she had been making it for. Herself. Always to herself. The self that had survived everything this far and refused, through every stripping away, every diminishment, every morning of being invisible in someone else's house, to stop believing that the door was out there somewhere. It had not looked like she expected. It was better than anything she had imagined. As things are, when they are real. As love is, the unexpected kind. The kind that arrives not in ideal circumstances, but in the ruins of other people's arrangements. The kind that has no business existing between two people with this much damage and this much distance between them and exists anyway. Stubbornly. Without apology. Answering to nothing but its own deep, inconvenient necessity. The kind that costs you something. Do. The only kind worth having. 6 months after J1 sat in a small Lagos courtyard and watched a sunset he had no business finding beautiful, the Kong legal team filed the final paperwork terminating all business agreements between Kong Industries and the Ose Mensa Trading Company. It was not done dramatically. J1 did not make a phone call. He did not send a message. He simply instructed his chief legal officer, in the same quiet tone he used for all consequential decisions, to close every open file connected to that family name, distribution agreements, pending contracts, letters of intent, all of it, with immediate effect and without further communication. The letter arrived at Chief Ose Mensah's Lagos office on a Tuesday morning. His assistant brought it in with the day's other correspondence, unremarkable in its plain white envelope, and set it on the broad mahogany desk beneath the framed photograph of Vivian at her university graduation. He read it twice. Then he set it down very carefully, the way you set down something that has just told you the thing you feared most was now confirmed, and he sat in his large chair in his large office surrounded by the architecture of a man who needed to feel powerful, and he felt, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, the precise opposite of that. The Kong distribution deal had been the backbone of 3 of his most significant revenue streams. Without it, the company's position was not immediately catastrophic, but it was not comfortable, and comfort was the thing Chief Ose Mensah had built his entire life around. Meetings followed. Restructuring conversations. The particular, grinding indignity of calling business partners to renegotiate terms from a position of reduced leverage. He did not call Amara. He understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives too late to be useful, that there was no version of that call that ended well for him. The girl he had shipped off to Seoul like a piece of surplus inventory was now the legal wife of the man whose lawyers had just ended his most profitable partnership. Whatever door had existed between them, he had closed it himself. He was precise enough to know it. He did not call Vivian either, for 3 days after the letter arrived. When he finally did, the conversation was brief and cold in the way that conversations are when everything that needed to be said has already been communicated by events. Vivian did not take it quietly. She was not by nature a woman who absorbed consequences with grace. She had grown up in a household where consequences were things that happened to other people, people with less money, less beauty, and fewer options. The realization that she had miscalculated, not just tactically but fundamentally, in a way that reveals a flaw in the calculator rather than the calculation, arrived slowly and then all at once, the way such realizations always do. She had gone to Seoul to reclaim a man she had never particularly wanted but had decided, upon seeing what his recovery looked like, that she had discarded too hastily. She had gone armed with Amara's journal and 6 years of accumulated knowledge about exactly where her stepsister's soft places were. She had executed her plan with her usual precision, and she had come home to find that precision was not the same as wisdom. J1 had not called her, had not communicated through lawyers or intermediaries, or any of the channels a man in his position might reasonably use to express his displeasure. He had simply, and this was the thing she found most unsettling, in the months that followed, done nothing in her direction at all. Not anger. Not recrimination. Simply the total, absolute withdrawal of his attention, as if she had ceased to be a relevant variable in any equation he was running. She had underestimated, she understood in retrospect, what it meant to manipulate a man who had spent his entire adult life identifying and neutralizing threats. He had not reacted to her as a wounded party. He had filed her under a category she suspected he reserved for things that were beneath the dignity of his anger and moved on. That was worse than anything he could have said. She moved out of her father's house 4 months later, not in triumph. Not in the dramatic fashion she had always imagined her departure from that household, but in the quiet, slightly diminished way of someone who needs to be somewhere else before the weight of a failed plan crushes whatever remains of her self-image. She moved to Abuja, got a job through a connection of a connection, started again, in the way that people sometimes have to start again when the life they built on other people's foundations finally runs out of ground. Nobody sent her off. Nobody came to check on her. She thought about Amara sometimes in the small hours of New City nights. Not with guilt. She was not yet in the part of her life where guilt had become available to her. With something more complicated and less nameable. The specific, uncomfortable awareness of a woman who had spent years treating someone as invisible and was now beginning to understand, too late and at too great a cost to everyone involved, what visibility actually looked like. She did not reach out. She did not know how. Perhaps one day she would learn. Aunt Doris stayed. This was, in its own way, the most honest thing about her. She was a woman who stayed. She had stayed in her marriage through its various difficulties and rearrangements. She had stayed in the household through the introduction of a stepdaughter she had never wanted and had treated, with practiced subtlety, as a permanent inconvenience. She stayed now, in the house that was slightly less financially comfortable than it had been, managing the domestic machinery of a diminished empire with the same efficient, affectless competence she had always brought to it. She did not talk about Amara. Not because she had decided there was nothing to say, but because she was a woman who had built her entire interior life around not saying the things that needed saying, and she was too old and too set to change the architecture of herself now. But sometimes, in the kitchen in the early morning before the house was awake, she stood at the window the way Abina used to stand at windows, not looking at anything specific, just standing, just being present to something she couldn't name. And she thought about a girl who had ironed blouses and been given a wooden stool to sit on, and had walked through 6 years of this household's particular cruelty without once losing the thing that made her herself. She thought, we should have been kinder. She thought, I should have been kinder. She did not say it to anyone, but she thought it. And perhaps that was where some things began. In the private, unwitnessed acknowledgement of a truth that arrived too late to change anything but was still, stubbornly, worth knowing. Amara heard about the termination of the Kong-Osei business agreements through J1's lawyer, who sent a formal notification as a matter of legal courtesy since she was, as his wife, a party to his business interests. She read the document once. Set it on the kitchen table of the Seoul mansion. She was back in Seoul by then. Had been for 2 months, and had returned not because anyone asked her to, but because she had decided to, which was the only reason she would ever go anywhere again for the rest of her life. She thought about Chief Osei Mensura's study, the mahogany desk, the framed photograph of Vivian, the clock on the wall she had counted minutes against while he used words like opportunity and security, and never once used the word choice. She thought about the wooden stool in the corner of Vivian's room. She thought about 6 years of ironing other people's blouses and eating dinner in the kitchen, and sleeping near the generator, and keeping her journal under the floorboards and telling herself, every single morning, that she would not be this forever. She put the document in the household file where it belonged. And she went to find J1. He was in the physiotherapy room. Not with Choi. Choi came 3 mornings a week, and this was an afternoon. He was alone at the parallel bars, the way she had once seen him through a gap in a door, and understood something fundamental about who he was beneath the armor. Except that now the door was open. She had left it open. She always left it open. They had stopped closing doors between them some time ago without either of them formally deciding to. And he looked up when she came in and did not close his expression the way he used to. He was doing the bars. She could see from the slight catch in his left leg that it had been a difficult session. His jaw was set in that particular way. But he was upright. He was moving. 12, she said, from the doorway. He reached the end. Turned. 11. I counted 12. You counted wrong. I have an accounting background, she said. I do not count wrong. The corner of his mouth moved. He reached for the water glass on the ledge, reached for it naturally, without the self-consciousness of before, because she had been putting water within his reach for long enough now that it had become simply a thing that was there when he needed it. He drank and looked at her with the full, unguarded regard that had taken him the better part of a year to stop rationing. The Osei papers came, she said. He nodded once. I know. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't tell me you were going to do it. It was a business decision, he said. J1. He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not guilt, not defensiveness. Something quieter and more considered. I should have told you, he said. It involved your family. You deserved to know it was coming. A pause. I am still. The almost smile, dry and self-aware, is learning the difference between decisions that are mine alone to make and decisions that belong to both of us. I am told it is a process. Who told you that? Choi, actually. He has opinions about everything. She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the room, not to the ledge, not to the bars, but to him directly, and she put her hand on the side of his face the way you touch something you are grateful for. He went very still under her hand, the way he always did when she touched him, not with tension, but with the particular stillness of someone receiving something they are still, even now, learning to believe they deserve. It's all right, she said. I'm not angry. You could be, he said. It would be reasonable. I know, she said. I'm choosing not to be. She looked at him steadily. That's the thing about choices, J1. Once you have them back, you get to decide what to do with them. She dropped her hand from his face, tilted her head toward the bars. 12 reps. 11. Do one more and we'll call it 12. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to love most, the one that was almost exasperated and entirely fond and sitting on top of something so much deeper and more permanent than either of those things that the surface emotions were almost beside the point. He turned back to the bars. Did one more. 12. The library, that night, smelled of old paper and cedar, and the particular sweetness she still hadn't identified after all these months and had stopped trying to name because some things were better simply lived in than analyzed. She was in the reading chair. He was at the desk in the corner. The lamp was on. Outside the window, Seoul arranged itself in the dark below them. Millions of lights, millions of people. The ordinary magnificent hum of a city that had no idea what was happening on the 43rd floor and had no need to. She was writing in her journal. The new one was the third one since she had come back to Seoul, because she filled them faster now. Not because her life was more dramatic, but because it was more worth recording. Small things, mostly. Specific things. The way he timed his coffee to the minute. The way he folded newspapers. The way he said her name, Amora, with the careful, particular weight of a man who understood that names were not casual things, that they were the sound another person made when they were calling you back to yourself. She wrote, I used to keep my journal under the floorboards. Now I leave it on the table, and nobody touches it, and I don't think about it. I don't know exactly when that changed. I think that might be what safety feels like from the inside. You stop bracing for the thing that isn't coming anymore. She paused, looked up. He was watching her from the desk, not reading, not working, just watching in the quiet way he had. When he saw her look up, he did not look away. He had stopped looking away. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I was just... He paused in that way of his choosing. Looking. At me. Yes. Why? He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all genuine questions. Because you are there, he said finally. And I find that I have not yet become accustomed to it. You being there. He said it simply, without embarrassment, without the old reflexive move toward irony that would have cushioned it. Just the plain truth of it. I don't think I want to become accustomed to it. I think I would like to keep noticing. She looked at him across the lamp-lit library. This man. This specific, impossible, extraordinary man who had spent 20 years deciding that need was weakness and had spent the last 6 months learning, one careful and often imperfect day at a time, that the bravest thing he would ever do was need someone and say so out loud. Do, she said softly. He smiled then. Not the almost smile. Not the reluctant corner-of-mouth thing she had catalogued in the early days. A full, real, unhurried smile that took up his whole face and had nowhere else it needed to be. Do, he said. And outside the window, Seoul glittered. And the library held them, the way good rooms hold the people who have learned to live in them, quietly, without fuss, with the simple dignity of a space that has finally, after a long time of waiting, been given something worth keeping. On the windowsill of a small room in Lagos, 2 gold earrings were no longer there. Amora wore them every day now. She had stopped putting them down. And here, at last, is where we leave them. But not without one final question. J1 didn't arrive with a speech or a grand gesture. He arrived with honesty, the one thing that had always cost him the most. He sent a bodyguard the night she left because he couldn't make himself stop caring. He read a journal by sunset light and did 10 reps every morning because it was the only conversation he had. And then he crossed an ocean and sat in a small Lagos room and told the truth about himself, fully, without armor, without guarantee, for the first time in his life. And Amara, who had been told since girlhood that she was not worth choosing, was chosen. Quietly, deliberately, completely. By someone who came all the way to her world to prove it. What moment in this story stayed with you the longest? The glass of water at the end of the parallel bars? The journal left on the bed? The bodyguard sent in anger was really sent in love? The word do finally said perfectly, at last? Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story found you at exactly the right time, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded. The love worth having is the kind that shows up. Even imperfectly. Even late. Even across 12,000 kilometers with no guarantee of how it ends. Because it showed up. And that is everything.